The year is 1922, and the thick smoke of a bitter civil war has finally cleared over the Irish countryside. Exhausted workers begin the grim task of clearing the smouldering ruins of a recently burnt medieval fortress. They pry away a heavy, charred slab of stone near the old chapel and suddenly discover a hidden drop plunging into absolute darkness. One worker shines a flickering lantern into the deep stone throat. The weak yellow light reveals a jagged wooden spike jutting upward from the dirt floor. Dozens of human skeletons are impaled on the rotting wood in a gruesome, silent scream. The workers eventually drag out 3 entire cartloads of shattered bones into the pale daylight. A truly chilling detail soon emerges when a gleaming gold pocket watch from the 1840s is found hopelessly tangled inside medieval ribs. This terrifying discovery suggests the slaughter hidden beneath the chapel spanned multiple centuries. Tourists today walk past the imposing restored walls of Leap Castle, admiring its grand dramatic facade. They see a beautiful, ancient monument standing proud against the green hills, but they do not hear the desperate echoes trapped deep in the bedrock. What specific human terror required a permanent slaughterhouse disguised as a royal home? What dark, incredible human truths are buried beneath these stones just waiting to drag us down into the dark? The fierce O'Carroll clan did not build Leap Castle to protect their vulnerable people. They built it strictly to enforce absolute dominance and project sheer terror across the contested Irish landscape. The founding patriarch possessed a blinding paranoia and a dangerously fragile ego that demanded total physical submission from everyone breathing around him. He intentionally ordered the looming fortress constructed directly over an ancient druidic ceremonial site, essentially claiming arrogant dominion over the old spirits of the earth itself. He ruthlessly forced starving local peasants to drag massive blocks of heavy grey stone through unforgiving terrain until their bare hands bled raw against the rough rock. The astronomical financial toll and the brutal human cost were entirely eclipsed by his desperate psychological need for absolute control. The paranoid founder foolishly believed these impossibly thick stone walls could permanently trap his dark sins and keep his many enemies permanently locked out. He thought he was building an impenetrable stone shield to guarantee his eternal ruling dynasty. He completely failed to realize the true lethal danger was the toxic ambition boiling violently within his own immediate bloodline. He created a perfect, unbreakable cage, but this temporary architectural triumph hid a much darker plot. The very first tragic blood spilled inside this magnificent fortress would not come from an invading foreign army, but from a trusted family hand holding a heavy steel blade in the dark. The year is 1532, and a heavy, suffocating tension grips the upper chapel of Leap Castle. The fierce patriarch of the violent O'Carroll dynasty has just drawn his final agonizing breath. An immediate and terrifying power vacuum now threatens to tear the ambitious family completely apart from the inside out. Thaddeus O'Carroll stands quietly before the ornately carved stone altar, wearing his heavy embroidered priestly vestments. He bows his head and begins chanting a solemn holy mass for the dark soul of his departed father. The flickering orange candlelight casts long, trembling shadows against the damp, cold stone walls. A small, terrified congregation kneels behind him, in absolute hushed reverence. They all intimately understand the violent, brutal stakes of an O'Carroll succession, yet absolutely nobody anticipates the horrifying sacrilege about to unfold in this supposedly divine, impenetrable sanctuary. The thick, heavy wooden doors suddenly explode inward, with a deafening, splintering crash that completely shatters the holy silence. His own blood brother Tige fiercely storms down the narrow central aisle. TG is entirely driven by a blinding political jealousy that has completely poisoned his dark, rotting soul. He possesses a terrifying, single-minded focus, and he does not hesitate or speak a single word of warning. Taiji violently lunges forward with all his physical might and plunges a heavy, jagged iron sword directly through his brother's back. The brutal strike happens right over the holy altar. The heavy steel blade violently tears through the sacred vestments and rips through fragile human bone. The paralyzed congregation watches in absolute frozen horror as the dying priest helplessly collapses forward, Hot crimson blood pools rapidly on the cold sacred stones directly beneath the wooden crucifix. TG stands completely motionless over the trembling, bleeding body of his own flesh and blood. He coldly watches the last spark of life drain, forever out of his brother's wide, staring eyes. He proudly claimed the ultimate Iron Throne through this brutal, unforgivable family murder. He forever cursed that high room as the Bloody Chapel, where visitors today still report an overwhelming sense of deep, suffocating dread. But this temporary stolen peace hid a much darker plot. Tej arrogantly thought eliminating his brother would immediately secure his absolute, unquestioned reign. He quickly realized his stolen bloody throne was constantly surrounded by heavily armed potential usurpers and unpaid debts. The dark crimson stain soaking deep into the chapel altar would incredibly soon be overshadowed by a much larger and vastly more terrifying mass murder. The paranoid victorious O'Carrolls desperately needed to celebrate a recent bloody military triumph while simultaneously eliminating a massive financial debt. They graciously invited their most fiercely loyal McMahon mercenary soldiers to a lavish, extravagant feast in the Grand Great Hall. The O'Carrolls promised to generously reward their brutal battlefield services. The exhausted, battered soldiers eagerly sat down at the long wooden tables, totally expecting heavy chests of gold and endless nights of drunken glory. They laughed loudly and boasted proudly, while a massive roaring fire warmed their scarred, freezing bodies. But the main course secretly waiting in the dark stone kitchen was bitter, ruthless betrayal. The O'Carrolls prepared a hidden toxic ingredient that would rapidly leave the massive dining hall completely and permanently silent. The heavily scarred McMahon mercenaries eagerly raised their heavy wooden cups high into the smoky air to toast their supposedly generous royal employers. These battle-hardened men had recently bled deeply into the muddy Irish soil, strictly to keep the paranoid O'Carroll family securely on the throne. The massive roaring fire in the Great Hall violently cast their dancing shadows against the ancient cold stone walls, creating a fleeting illusion of warmth and safety. The trusting soldiers eagerly gulped down the sweet dark red wine, completely unaware that the vicious O'Carrolls are watching them from the high table with entirely cold dead eyes. The lords of the castle do not touch their own silver goblets. They simply sit in terrifying absolute silence while the deadly trap snaps shut. The sweet imported wine is heavily laced with a fast-acting and intensely painful lethal poison. The horrific effects begin almost immediately. Strong veteran warriors, who had fearlessly survived countless brutal sieges, abruptly drop their cups and violently collapse onto the hard stone floor. They desperately gasp for air, while frantically clawing at their own burning throats. The grand dining hall instantly devolves into an absolute chaotic nightmare of agonizing shrieks and desperate thrashing limbs. The ruthless hosts slowly stand up and casually step over the agonizing dying bodies of the exact same brave men who had just fought for their survival. The O'Carrolls literally refused to pay their legitimate debts and chose mass murder as a simple accounting solution. The lifeless, contorted bodies were quickly dragged away by silent servants and thrown carelessly into the dark, unforgiving night. Yet the blindingly paranoid O'Carrolls desperately needed a permanent and entirely hidden architectural solution for their rapidly growing list of perceived enemies. A simple shallow grave outside the walls could be easily discovered, and poison left far too much messy evidence on the dining room floor. They required a flawless execution chamber that would completely erase a human being from existence, without leaving a single trace of blood. They deliberately designed a terrifying secret room hidden directly behind the bloody chapel, specifically engineered for prolonged, agonizing human suffering. It was a narrow, pitch-black stone hole, known as an oubliette, where forgotten men would casually drop down to die, a slow, madness-inducing death in the absolute dark. The victims would fall blindly onto a jagged wooden spike and listen to their own hot blood, slowly dripping away in the terrifying subterranean silence. But when you bury a betrayed man alive, the dark ancient earth always deeply remembers the exact location of his agonizing final breath. The heavy stone floorboards could easily muffle the frantic, desperate screams for a few short decades. Centuries later, the restless, furious ghosts of the brutally impaled would inevitably wake up and demand a terrifyingly public and deeply violent historical reckoning. The year is now the late 1800s, and a dangerous new era dawns over the blood-soaked stones of Leap Castle. The ancient violent O'Carroll dynasty has finally faded into dark history, but their terrible echoing legacy remains completely trapped inside the heavy walls. Mildred Darby now lives comfortably within the Grand Fortress, and she foolishly decides to casually dabble in the terrifying dark arts. She views the Victorian occult craze as a thrilling evening entertainment, entirely ignoring the massive historical slaughterhouse buried directly beneath her expensive leather boots. She actively conducts forbidden demonic seances, right inside the exact same Great Hall, where the poisoned mercenaries violently choked on their own blood. She carelessly reaches her mind out into the pitch-black unknown, and something ancient and deeply malevolent fiercely grabs her hand in return. She accidentally awakens an incredibly powerful evil entity, literally born from centuries of endless agonizing murder. A terrifyingly foul stench of rotting, forgotten corpses quickly begins to fill the grand decorated corridors at night. A twisted, shadowy, malformed creature begins relentlessly stalking the absolutely terrified Darby family through the dark, twisting hallways. Mildred arrogantly thought she was merely playing an innocent, fashionable parlour game to amuse her wealthy, aristocratic friends. She realised far too late that her foolish supernatural meddling had completely unlocked a terrifying metaphysical door that could absolutely never be shut again. The deeply angry, vengeful spirits of the brutally slaughtered desperately demanded an ultimate fiery justice for their stolen lives. The impossibly thick medieval stone walls could no longer physically contain the absolute concentrated evil festering deep inside the bedrock. The destructive and deeply violent year 1922 rapidly approached like a dark looming storm on the Irish horizon. The fiercely burning fires of a massive political rebellion would finally give this arrogantly cursed castle exactly the brutal, devastating end it so richly deserved. The violent Irish Civil War finally reaches the towering iron gates of Leap Castle in 1922. The deeply furious local rebels storm the ancient property and violently set the massive stone fortress completely ablaze. They are determined to utterly destroy this looming aristocratic symbol of historical oppression. The intensely roaring orange flames entirely consume the heavy wooden roof, and the ancient supporting floors totally collapse with a deafening apocalyptic crash. The intense inferno burns away centuries of dark secrets, and violently exposes the hidden oubliette to the harsh, unforgiving daylight. The terrifying mysteries planted deep in the dark earth are finally violently ripped open for the modern world to strictly witness. The mysterious gold pocket watch found tangled inside the medieval bones is finally chillingly explained. The cruel ruling families ruthlessly threw perceived enemies and unwanted servants down that dark hole well into the modern Victorian era. It proves the hidden aristocratic cruelty absolutely never stopped, even while elegant ladies drank afternoon tea just upstairs. The original blinding paranoia of the founding patriarch directly created a rotting, cursed soul that completely destroyed the family line and the physical building itself. He built impossibly thick stone walls, strictly to lock out his external enemies. Yet his arrogant architectural monument to absolute power simply became an inescapable burning tomb for his own doomed descendants. His grand illusion of safety shattered completely when the fire tore down the walls, exposing his legacy as nothing but a literal pile of broken bones in the cold dirt. Curious modern tourists casually walk through the partially restored romantic ruins of Leap Castle today. They wander blindly through the ancient halls holding bright digital cameras and smiling brightly for quick fleeting photographs. They completely ignore the chilling, sudden drop in temperature when they cross the exact threshold of the bloody chapel. They often smell a sudden, distinct scent of sharp sulphur and rotting damp earth drifting unexpectedly through the heavy air. These innocent visitors are walking directly over the invisible, lingering ghosts of betrayed brothers and violently poisoned soldiers. Thick, impenetrable medieval stone can successfully hide horrific human sins for a century or two, but the deep, ancient earth always ultimately demands a final, terrifying historical reckoning. The grand imposing architecture still proudly stands defiant against the harsh howling Irish weather, yet its ancient decaying walls are held together entirely by the tragic trapped ghosts of those who violently perished and never truly left. The intensely dark history of this specific fortress serves as a grim, eternal reminder about the incredibly fragile nature of the human psyche. Absolute, unquestioned power does not protect a human soul from the brutal, inevitable consequences of blinding, ruthless ambition. The paranoid founding patriarch originally built this impenetrable physical fortress, specifically to guarantee his eternal, glorious legacy. He completely failed to understand that the innocent blood soaked deep into the bedrock foundation would eventually poison every single aristocratic generation that followed him. We enthusiastically visit these grand towering monuments to strictly marvel at ancient wealth and superior military engineering. We far too often entirely forget the terrible, agonizing human price paid to drag and lay every single block of heavy grey stone. The terrifying true story of this specific bloody Irish dynasty forces the modern viewer to silently confront a deeply uncomfortable psychological reality. The most dangerous and terrifying monsters in our shared human history are absolutely never the supernatural elemental creatures hiding in the pitch-black cellar shadows. The absolute worst monsters are always the deeply flawed, desperate humans standing right next to us in the broad, bright daylight, holding a hidden blade. The silent, unfeeling ancient stones of Leap Castle will forever remember the exact terrifying moment the fatal dagger finally struck.